Thank you. And I'd like to make a brief introduction to my speakers and to the subject. The theme is Sacrifice and Philanthropy, What's in it for me? And we're going to look at, I think, the motivations, the value, and questions of what is voluntary and what is obligatory and what is coerced in terms of giving. We've got 4 very interesting speakers. I'm going to introduce them. First of all, Dr. Piers Ben, who's a writer and philosopher, an author of Commitment and Ethics, a visiting lecturer in ethics at Haythrop College, London. Next to speak will be Anthony Lewis-Crosby, who is a fundraiser and concert promoter, and he also reminded us that he worked in the Barbican for 15 years. The third speaker will be Colin Tweedy, and Colin is the Chief Executive of the Building Centre Trust and formerly Chief Executive of Arts and Business. And our final speaker, Dr. Jamie White, who is a philosopher and writer and author of Crimes Against Logic and Quack Policy. So, let's start. Piers.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Okay, so sacrifice and philanthropy, what's in it for me? I didn't mean this title to be unduly cynical, but I suppose it's a good way to start off because many people think that in reality there is no such thing as genuinely altruistic or philanthropic motivation, and that everybody who sets themselves up as a philanthropist, people like Bill Gates or more recently David Beckham apparently, is really doing it for something they can get out of it, maybe in terms of reputation or something else that's in their interests. Well, it seems to me that as a matter of empirical fact, no doubt the motivations of philanthropists are mixed, and there may well be a self-interested component to them. But I'm not one of those people who thinks there's no such thing as altruistic motivation. There plainly is such a thing, and you need to stretch things very badly to argue that there isn't. For example, if you commit the sort of standard, what I might call undergraduate error of saying that if somebody enjoys helping others, then they're doing it for themselves because they're doing it for their own enjoyment, well, I think the obvious reply to that is to distinguish enjoying something that benefits another person from enjoying something that benefits yourself. And there clearly is such a thing as caring about other people and enjoying things that benefit them. So I take it there are philanthropists, many are sincere, they're not just in it for themselves. Moreover, I'm going to suggest in the next 5 minutes or so that philanthropy should be encouraged. Philanthropy is a good thing. The more of it, the better. And I shall also emphasize, as I think was brought out in the paper blurb for this session, that there's a great difference between encouraging philanthropy and coercing it. If one of the great moral virtues of philanthropy is that it is voluntary, that philanthropists give voluntarily, then clearly that would be negated if there were an element of genuine coercion in that. For example, nobody can be praised for giving the contents of their house to a burglar because they, unless they chose to, I suppose, because they just got burgled. So one of the great attractions of philanthropy is that it is voluntary and that nobody is under any obligation, no legal obligation to engage in it. However, that's entirely consistent with encouraging philanthropy and proposing moral reasons why it's a good thing. However, philanthropy may be criticised, and I want just briefly to sketch 2 reasons, broadly, why it may be criticised and how we might respond to those reasons. The first reason is that when philanthropists are praised, as they often are, when they get fame for themselves or their foundations, they're actually getting an unduly high reputation for their beneficence. And one can spell this out with reference to a famous argument, or at least famous for those who like reading these things, from the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who 40 years ago argued that everybody, however much money they had or however little, had a moral duty to go on and on giving more and more of their money. He talks about money, but it could, of course, be time or effort, until they reached the point beyond which they'd be suffering a greater cost themselves than they'd be providing benefit for the recipients. And Singer's very relentless about this. And in this connection, in 2006, he wrote an article in New York Times Magazine, What Should a Billionaire Give and What Should You?, in which he argues really for the same conclusion, that there's a great obligation on all of us, whether we're rich or not, so long as we have just about enough to spare, to go on and on giving our time, or in his case, he talks about money, until we get to the point when any further donations by us would be a worse loss for ourselves than for the intended recipients. That's very, very tough, and hardly anybody believes it. I used to find when talking about this subject once a year in lectures, I persuaded myself for about 3 hours a year that Singer was right. But then ordinary laziness and self-deception kicks in, and I think to myself, he's got to be wrong somewhere. There's got to be something wrong with this. Well, I think there probably is something wrong with it, but here's the point. What Singer says about Bill Gates, probably the most famous philanthropist who's given a truly astounding sum in terms of money, is that, he should be praised. It's a good thing. He's done more than most very rich people. That deserves credit. But when you think about it, he's still a very rich man, even when he's given half his money away. He's still extremely rich. Shouldn't he be giving more and more? So that's one problem. Really, philanthropists aren't as beneficent as they're made out to be. Here's another. This is a sort of left-wing criticism. It's a criticism that says philanthropic giving should not be encouraged for these reasons. For one thing, it gives the state or the government an excuse not to raise taxes and an excuse not to contribute. It's part of a general socialist objection that you sometimes find to charity. It's all very well, but charity depends upon the whim of those who want to give. Notoriously, charity does not meet need, or if it does so very arbitrarily and randomly. And what you need is a system that actually meets need, and that system might involve high taxation, redistributive taxation, state centralized giving, and not just leaving it to the whim of givers. And another problem with this is it says it just takes the moral pressure off the rest of us. The point is, it doesn't really meet need. Now, it seems to me that one can and should approve of philanthropy, whatever your politics. I'm not taking a view here about redistributive taxation. There's something to be said for it. I suspect that other panelists think there's less to be said for it. But one can and should be a giver, whatever your politics. And I'll end with a remark made by the sadly late but very interesting orthodox Marxist philosopher Jerry Cohen. Well, he was an orthodox Marxist most of his working life, who wrote a book with this wonderful title shortly before he died, "If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?" Meaning, of course, to poke a jibe at those friends of his who had left-wing politics, were socialists, and yet led very nice lives, who thought, perhaps, that once they'd voted for the right party, which they probably knew would never be elected anyway, so it didn't matter, once they'd made the right political motions, they needn't bother about giving. Cohen is out to expose the sham of this sort of left-wingery. You can do both. So in summary, we can take a neutral view of taxation. We should nonetheless give, and we should encourage philanthropists. Thank you.
Thanks, Piers. Anthony.
Thank you very much. I shall be aiming to be a little more practical than Piers, at not having his experience of philosophy. I've actually enjoyed looking at definitions of philanthropy in dictionaries in the last few days. And firstly, I've looked at three particular definitions. All of them stress the origins of the word philanthropy, which comes from the Greek, of course, a love of, and then through anthropology, a love of mankind. But they differ then as how it goes on from there. One of them, probably the most famous dictionary of all, talks of practical benevolence, especially charity on a large scale. Another one talks of that the effort or wish to increase the well-being of humanity as by charitable works, an active or institution designed to benefit human welfare. And I personally prefer the second of those definitions, and I do believe that philanthropy is for all. Last Wednesday, I happened to be at Punchestown Racecourse in Ireland, handing over a cheque for €16,000 as the culmination of the Irish leg of my racecourse challenge, in which I am going around every single racecourse in the UK and Ireland raising money for cystic fibrosis, a charity dear to my heart. I've finished the Irish leg, which was why I was handing over the cheque for €16,000, and I'm 2/3 of the way through the UK racecourses. Now, the point I want to make is that the money that I've raised has come from many sources, but I wanted to point out to the generosity of Irish people in responding to a good cause, and cystic fibrosis is very much a charity that is supported in Ireland because of the large number of people with cystic fibrosis in that country. But the majority of the money that I've raised has come through bucket collections at the end of race meetings. Those that go racing in Ireland come from all backgrounds and all ages. Per head, people have given more in Ireland at my bucket collections all over the country, partly because the €2 coin is much more common currency than the £2 coin in this country. So people are throwing €2 coins much more readily. And partly because there is a real tradition of giving after Mass on a Sunday and at other times. Of course, less people in Ireland are going to Mass these days, thanks to the disgrace that has fallen on the Catholic Church to a degree. In my book, this is philanthropy by the general public. And in some cases, the poorest people, this can be termed a sacrifice. Earlier this year in Ireland, the 1% Difference campaign was launched. The principle is that everybody, and I mean everybody, can and should give 1% of their income or 1% of their time to charities. This very public campaign received an endorsement by many leaders in Ireland, and last week indeed from Bill Clinton, another instance of our leading philanthropists in the world. You can go on their website to find out all about it, the 1% Difference. If you Google that, it will come up with all sorts of interesting information. And there they give examples based on what you say your income might be, as to what you can support, and also how much time 1% a day, a week, a year would actually amount to. I like Bill Clinton's summary of this campaign in which he was praising it. He said, it will democratize giving. Further, because everybody can afford it, time or money. It will democratize giving. Can we set up such a scheme in this country? I don't see why not, in order to boost philanthropy at all levels of society. I wonder indeed if we're missing a trick with the National Lottery, and that we do not emphasize enough that by entering the lottery, whatever your means, you are supporting good causes. There is too much emphasis on winning, even though only a tiny fraction can win the lottery, and if my experience is anything to go by, you hardly ever win the minimum £10, or is it now £20 as of last week. As a member of the Church of England, I am expected to tithe money to support the church. And being in a rich London parish, much of that money goes to support the poorer parishes in South London. Giving is therefore expected as a Christian duty, and it is in so many other faiths as well, as we may hear later in this debate. I enjoy the challenge of fundraising for causes that matter. You can, of course, only support so many charities, and my motto overall is to have fun fundraising. It is not, therefore, a sacrifice to me, but I fully understand that giving can be really difficult for many people, particularly in recessionary times. But I suggest that it is possible for anybody, and we should make more of and celebrate those that do, at whatever level. In the press recently, it was said negatively that 25% of the UK population do not give anything to charity. I saw it the other way around. 75% do. And if we adopted, say, the Irish model, we could raise that percentage considerably. Huge sums do go to good causes through the National Lottery. Let's celebrate that too. Finally, 2 words of caution. I recognise that a large number of my age group, I'm sure you can work out what that might be, are much better off than those both who've gone before and those who are still in work, thanks to company pension schemes that are collapsing, which will not be so available or reliable to those that are still in work, and indeed they're going to have to work to a much older age to benefit. Therefore, it may be for many, it may be harder to be as philanthropic in the future and more of a sacrifice. And secondly, a point I'm sure will come out across, we must ensure that government funding of the welfare, arts and charity sector as a whole is not reduced in any way as a result of any initiative that might emerge. Thank you.
Colin.
Thank you. This week, arguably, the richest and most philanthropic people in the world have all flown into London. Sadly, they've not flown in for this Battle of Ideas weekend, though hopefully some of them are here, maybe in this room. But most of them are here for the Frieze Art Fair, which is housed in Regent's Park since Tuesday. Well, it opened on Thursday, but Tuesday and Wednesday were only for VIPs. Well, actually, Tuesday from 11 o'clock was for VVVIPs. They all came, well, some of them by private jet, some of them certainly by chauffeur-driven car. I've never seen so many black-tinted windows in Land Rover 4x4s crowded in a line on the pavement at Regent's Park. But basically, they're here to basically display their wealth. And by displaying their wealth, they're doing it by buying art. Now, some people would say that is not philanthropy. Others would argue that they are not only buying work of artists who are not essentially rich, even though David, well, I shouldn't be slagging off artists, but Damien Hirst is, of course, a rather rich man. Rather ironically, his auction of his work was on the same day as Lehman Brothers crashed. As he said, more people care about my butterflies than the world economy, as he said at the time. But the fact is that art sponsorship has often been seen as one of the success stories of philanthropy in the modern era. And I spent 28 years of my professional life as Chief Executive of Arts and Business promoting sponsorship and philanthropy. Now, Arts and Business's figures for the private sector giving to the arts last year, or 2011, 2012, was a total private sector sum of £660 million. That broke down into business giving of business sponsorship at 113 million, which is basically static. Trusts and foundations were up 23 million to 173 million, but individual giving has soared to 372 million. So effectively, we are now seeing, if you see the public sector for the arts at 1 billion, we're now seeing actually more than 50% in addition coming from the private sector. Now, is this good or bad? It's good if you are one of 25 arts institutions, including this great cultural institution here at the Barbican in London, because you will receive 90% of that money. 25 institutions will receive 90% of all private sector funding for the arts. People talk about a north-south divide, but in fact London has become an island all to itself. You can go through parts of the West End and Mayfair, for example, of an evening and find that all the apartments of that area are dark. They're all owned by rich investors and they don't live here. But they all, and they certainly don't pay tax here, but they are of course all perceived as philanthropists here. As I said, the majority of our great arts institutions in the capital are receiving a huge sum of philanthropy. But it's ironic that while philanthropy for culture and civilized inverted causes is on the up, institutions which were founded by the great Andrew Carnegie Libraries, are closing throughout the country. So rather ironically, some of the greatest philanthropists in the world, and Carnegie said, "He who dies rich dies shamed." Now, he was one of the dodgiest businessmen, perhaps, of the American era. but he was also one of the most philanthropic. And he believed that actually his phrase, "he who dies rich dies shamed," is an important one for his generation. Piers mentioned that Bill Gates certainly will not die poor, but will he die shamed? Perhaps not, but he actually has said he is not going to be giving his wealth to his children, that actually they will be given a few million each. Most of us would rather like that. Anyway, but the fact is that his wealth will go to his foundation, effectively 95%, which means that though he will not die personally poor, his wealth will go permanently to philanthropic organisations. In the Financial Times last Saturday, on the House and Home section, the phrase which I was fascinated with, "When the words wealth and status come together, they equate with the arts." When wealth and status come together. So a lot of philanthropy is about status. It's about being seen and recognised. Now, the present coalition government has, if you look at the honours system every summer and every new year, more and more people are being given knighthoods and CBs, etc., for philanthropy, and the word philanthropy is used. What would be interesting is how many of these honoured people pay UK tax. Is it something which all of us here think you pay your tax first and you do your philanthropy second? And I think it's an interesting debate because obviously philanthropic giving is tax deductible, but of course it's only effectively deductible if you're rich, because most giving is anonymous and not through gift aid, even though, of course, all governments of all political persuasions have tried to encourage more and more people to use the tax system. Anthony Julius, the great sort of lawyer and writer on the arts, he wrote a phenomenally important book on T.S. Eliot, said that in Judaism, the only real philanthropy is anonymous, that it can't be other than that. So I would say that this is a very important subject because we are now seeing so much of our world, some would say distorted by wealth. And I would like to finish off by quoting, and some of you may have heard this before, the tutor to Henry VIII, when Henry VIII was a child, John Skelton, taught Henry VIII as a boy many litanies to memorise, but one he did memorise quite well was the following: "Do not be mean, love poets, athletes are two a penny, but patrons of the arts are rare."
Jamie.
A lot of people, rich Americans now, talk about giving back. So I think they get rich and they say they're going to give something back. And the idea that they have a kind of obligation to give back stems, I think, from a misunderstanding of how the rich get rich. And also how the rich get rich, how the rich can benefit the poor. And it all centers around this term that you hear quite a lot in economic discussions, which is trickle down. So the idea is that it's okay to have rich people because they spend their money and they might spend it on things that poor people supply, and that's good for the poor people. And also they might give money, they might act charitably, and then so their wealth will trickle down to other people. And this expression is usually used by those wishing to mock the idea that the rich benefit the poor, and they show that not much trickles down. But the whole thing involves a gross misunderstanding. In a free market, and most markets are still free, banking isn't, but in most markets, say computing, you get rich by supplying something that people value higher than the price you charge. So that's why they buy it. If the price of something is higher than the value you put in it, you won't buy it. If you value it higher than the price, you buy it. And actually, in economics, the difference between how much you pay and how much you would have paid is called consumer surplus. Now, you can only get rich in a free market by supplying a lot of consumer surplus. You sell a lot of stuff, you make stuff, sell it, or provide some service and sell it. You do that a lot, and you make a lot of money. In the process of doing that, you've supplied a lot of consumer surplus, because people wouldn't have bought that stuff if they didn't value it higher than the price you charged. You have benefited society in the process of getting rich. You have nothing to give back. You've already given. I don't mean to say that you've given out of grand desire to give. You've probably been trying to enrich yourself. But nevertheless, you have benefited society, and you have no debt to society on account of having got rich. Now, here you are sitting on this big pile of money. What are you going to do with it? Well, you probably have done something with it already. Nobody actually puts their money under the mattress now. And even if you do put your money under the mattress, you're benefiting society, because by withholding your money, you lower the price of everything else. That's to say, you make resources available to other people because you're not consuming. That makes, it's just mathematical. There's a certain amount of resource around. If you save your money and don't consume it, put it under the mattress, those resources, there are more resources for other people, so the price of those other resources falls. It's very hard, actually, not to benefit people if you're rich. Now, what you might do, though, is you might decide, well, I'm going to become charitable. I've got all this money, I'm going to become charitable. And all that does, the difference between doing that and leaving your money under the mattress, is that instead of spreading the benefit far and wide, so if I don't spend my money at all, everybody gets the benefit in proportion to how much cash they have, actually. So their cash goes up a little bit in purchasing power, they can get more stuff for any amount of cash they've got. Everybody gets the benefit equally. Now, instead I say, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to help the needy. Then the benefit goes to the needy. In fact, goes to, of course, is your conception of the needy. And what the needy get is, again, not what they want, necessarily, but your conception of what they should have. So you say, well, I think that what would benefit these people is more education, let's say. And so you set up a school. And that's grand, that's nice. And you may have I'm not disputing, you may have absolutely grand motives. You may genuinely mean it. But the problem is that you don't know if that really is the best thing for these people. You think you do. You may have a rather exalted sense of your wisdom, having got so rich. But there's no guarantee that you really do. So what I would recommend for the rich who want to benefit society is to just keep doing what they did in the first place, because what they did in the first place did benefit society, and not according to their conception of what's good and bad, but according to consumers' conception. They offered something, consumers showed that they shared, that they wanted that by being willing to spend enough money to make this guy rich. Well, try and do it again. Come up with something else that people want and see if you can do that. And so if you really want to benefit society as a rich person, you should keep trying to get richer and richer and richer. And then you'll know if you really are. The minute you stop and decide I'm going to start giving my money away, that's the point at which you've stopped supplying people with what they want and started indulging your moral preferences at the expense of the rest of society. Because remember, you can't do it at no expense to society. By withholding the money, you were already benefiting society. All you're doing is allocating the benefit on certain groups with certain things. But you've no longer got any test for whether you're getting the answer right. In a market, you've got a test for whether you're getting that answer right. In charity, you don't. And I'll just end, because, I'm really, in a way, I don't think in the same terms, making Piers's point, which is that charity often misses its target. And this is why those people who are the beneficiaries of charity have historically resented the charitable. Because you're taking, it's demeaning. This person is putting themselves in a position of moral superiority to you. I don't mean that they're not doing it by giving you money. That's kind. They're doing it by giving you what they feel you need, little person, poor little man, who can't make decisions for himself. I would like to see, if you must give charity, if you're overwhelmed by this urge, just give the poor cash. Just give them cash, let them spend it as they wish. Then their preferences will then be satisfied. They never do that, of course. They always give them something they need. And this is why it's quite right and quite understandable that the poor resent the rich. If only they'd stop being so goddamn charitable. Thank you.
Before we go out to take some questions from the floor, I'd just like actually to look at some of the the very different viewpoints expressed in the panel, and thanks, Jamie, for that one, because it's taken the argument in a very different direction, I think. And we started off, Piers, with a look at the kind of the morality behind these kind of principles, and there was a lot of talk, really, from this side of the table about the kind of religious and moral principles that underpin acts of generosity, acts of kindness, acts of giving, and I also think that there was that actually questioned then the grand act of giving, the public and the great act of philanthropy, where the philanthropist draws attention to themselves and actually suggested that a more moral kind of giving, or a better kind of giving, resided in the small anonymous act of kindness, the people who put into the bucket after the church service in order to do good, or gave their time to do good. And I didn't see that, Jamie, and you made any distinction. You were talking there in a kind of technical way about creating wealth, and how creating wealth is in and of itself a good, yeah? Mm-hmm. But you didn't touch upon any of the... I wonder if you would like to respond to it. Do you think that first of all, that there is a moral good in let's think of the small acts of kindness that people perform, the voluntary acts of kindness?
Well, I'll take this opportunity to answer the question, but to mention Peter Singer. Peter Singer's example about how we should all give and give and give until we hit the point where we're as poor as our beneficiaries. And that's the idea. And Peter Singer makes a lot of arguments along these lines. And what's unusual about, well, it's not unusual, unfortunately. Peter Singer is the kind of philosopher who abstracts away almost entirely from realities about human beings. In fact, we have very different levels of concern for different people. Strangers, for example. I think Adam Smith said something like, you hear the news of hundreds of thousands of people dying in flooding in some foreign country, and it would cause you less grief than a paper cut on your little finger. And it's sad but true. And most of these little acts of kindness and so on, which of course humans do all the time, they're directed towards people we know, and or organizations that we have some real personal affinity with. I mean, for example, people tend to give to their own university, not any old university. Peter Singer would find that weird and terrible, right? Why personal attachments have got to be eliminated from all of these matters. And I suppose what I'm saying is that when philanthropy starts going beyond what I would call an expression of natural affiliations. So, for example, everybody looks after their children. Then things start looking a little odd to me. I think that you're likely to start indulging yourself as a philanthropist. So, for example, it's interesting that so much goes into the arts. Why does so much philanthropy go into the arts? Well, because that's a fun kind of philanthropy, unlike dealing with, nasty little street kids in Brazil or something.
Is there a new kind of philanthropy emerging here? Is it different from the philanthropy that's attached to the idea of sacrifice and of an obligation or a religious obligation?
I'm not sure that it is that different. It's certainly developed, and I was referred, of course, to the democratization of it. When I worked in Liverpool running an orchestra, and I have to say that the arts are as much a charity, and particularly all levels of the arts, whether they're the great Tate or the humble, small and vital local community theatre, require funding because the support is not there to make it possible. But when I was working in Liverpool, the feeling by the rich were that they did not want to be known to be giving, because it was a much more, in a sense, democratic society, and they would feel that they would stand out from that society if they were too much recognised. There were one or two, obviously, that wanted to be recognised, but there were many that didn't want to, but still gave considerable sums of money to support the orchestra and the arts in Liverpool. And I think that's probably true in parts of Manchester and the north generally, whereas in London there seems to be the other way around, or the south, where people want to be recognised by name, and the philanthropy goes down the way that Colin's talking about, where it's want to be seen to be given as opposed to be giving generally.
I think in Christian theology, the story of the widow's mite is known to most people, and that is still true today, that in percentage terms, the poor give more than the rich. The rich may give more in sort of in numbers, but in percentage of their overall giving, it is always the poor, in inverted commas, who give more. I mean, obviously, we've seen in the modern era, and we'll see it more and more, is the use of technology in philanthropy, which is from crowdfunding to, which has been phenomenally successful in America, obviously, for the funding recently of, say, the Democratic Party, and particularly Obama's election as president. And of course, in Britain, we've seen, say, Comic Relief as an amazing fundraising activity. Now, people see that as fund giving, but it's also about identity. I mean, the one thing about the digital world is you can quickly identify with the cause you're giving to, whether it's a theatre or a community AIDS project in Africa, so that we are more instantly know what we're giving to. And I think that will, again, transform giving, or as people say, democratizing it. But of course the danger is, I mean, I used to always say at Arts and Business that philanthropy and sponsorship, private giving, should be a supplement to, not a substitute for the state. But I think the right in political thinking believes that the private is better than the public. And that, to me, is a disaster. But it is, I think, very much the Tea Party movement's reeling, as we've heard, seen in the last 3 weeks, is basically public bad, private good. And I think it's a mixed economy is what we are seeing. But I think we just need to grab the money from where it comes, but make sure that the state, certainly in the Western world, is preeminent rather than the private sector.
We're talking about the sort of the ends, if you like, but I think in your starting point, you talked about the motivation, and that in itself, it's almost as if we're instrumentalizing giving here and philanthropy and talking about what the outcomes are, the impacts are. What about the gesture or the imperative?
Yes, it's a difficult problem, because you could put the problem as follows. Would you rather have a world in which everybody who gave voluntarily and it cost them something in personal terms? They suffered a bit, but not a great deal of good was done. Or a world in which, say, money was taken from people by compulsory taxation or whatever, and a huge amount of good was done, but nobody really displayed any virtue in doing this. And of course, you need both. You need to, I think that a virtue is shown by giving something that costs you something, but it's not shown by giving something that doesn't cost you very much, like tossing a 50p to a big issue salesman. And no virtue is shown by having it taken from you either. Clearly, we want a world in which both things occur. On the question, though, of our duties, our personal obligations, I just want to take up one of Jamie's points. I mean, Jamie, I think you're right to say that Peter Singer does abstract away from actual motivations, but to some extent he accepts that. I mean, one of the objections to Singer, you could say, is that, okay, what would the world look like if everybody followed his advice? Well, everybody would be writing cheques to Oxfam. What about the people who have to deliver the mail with the cheques? Well, they should be writing cheques to Oxfam too. They won't be delivering the mail. I mean, you can have all sorts of absurd situations like that. Singer, of course, knows that. He says that, actually, what we should tell people is they should give 10% of their income away, because that's something they might just about manage. The truth is they should give almost everything. But just tell people just to give a bit, because that might be better propaganda. So Singer's not being totally unrealistic. And this is my problem. I think that nobody can really consider this question without having some sort of answer to Singer. I mean, Singer's a utilitarian. I'm not. Singer thinks we have to maximize our donations because we have to do as much good as possible. I think there are personal relationships and projects that compete with that. But the problem is, you can surely most people can give more than they do without seriously sacrificing their personal relationships and projects and all these things that people put up as obstacles to charitable giving. We can give more. And then as to the point that, give people what they want rather than what they need, absolutely. I think, if you give the poor cash, that's fine. You give them what they need, what they want. But I would add that very often you do know what they want. You don't always not know. You often do know what they want. They'll tell you. So you can give them that. So we're not off the hook.
Two questions, because to me, there doesn't seem to be a problem of charity, in a sense. Every time I go on my Facebook page, there seems to be millions of people running for charity. And I guess that's the question I would like to ask, because I think, Anthony, you said philanthropy is the love of mankind, and you can also see, you sort of see when Carnegie was, here's loads of things and libraries and stuff like that, but now it does seem to be very much people have to have the badge. There's that classic Seinfeld when Kramer's running for AIDS charity, but he doesn't want to wear the badge, and in the end the whole of the people who are running run after him, really angry that he's not putting his identity. So is there something changing in philanthropy and charity when there does seem to be quite a me factor as opposed to a more universal love of mankind? And also, Jamie, I was really interested in your thing about saying charity it has to be personal or much more personal. And it seems to me every time I'm on the bus at the moment there's some poster from these medical charities, and there really are now, it would be your child dying of breast cancer, or there's a poster on a bus when, oh no, I've got the news of type 2 diabetes, and men and women are, absolutely distraught, which actually, I'm not saying you shouldn't look at type 2 diabetes, but it's not exactly you're going to die tomorrow. But there does seem to be much, much more this emphasis of sensationalism, personalisation of charitable giving. I just wondered what the panel...
Rather than looking at giving in terms of the many, many small donations from ordinary people versus the large sort of set-piece donations from institutions, the way I look at it, and like the panel to sort of comment on this really, is the difference between philanthropy as a private act that people undertake, a little bit like the kind of Good Samaritan, or it could be the Good Samaritan on a big scale. And on the other hand, philanthropy as a big sort of public set-piece lifestyle politics sort of act. And if you think about philanthropy in relation to the third world, developing world, every year we have Red Nose Day, we have kind of Live Aid, these kind of events, and these have sort of become, in a way, the public face of development politics. They're not just charitable acts of giving, they've filled up the public sphere, which used to be about discussing the causes of these problems and how people could make a difference about it, and common interest and solidarity. That seems to have been replaced with a kind of emotional response to the image of the starving African child. So I don't know what people think about that, because it just seems to me, on the one hand, incredibly mean to criticise anybody who's giving something, but on the other hand, this sort of personalised morality seems to foreclose a discussion of political morality and political solutions.
I'd heard before, as one of the speakers mentioned, that people who are poorer tend to give proportionately a much higher percentage of both their time and their income to other people in need, and this is just an invitation to speculate. I was wondering what the different panel members thought the relevant psychological explanation for that was, because that might be quite interesting as to why that's true.
I was very interested in Jamie's argument about getting rich benefiting society, and I can see the sense in it, but I'll give you the obvious objection, which I'm sure you've heard before, which is that crack dealers and pornographers also create a lot of consumer surplus, as does Justin Bieber. And we would all question whether these actually do benefit society. Even if we acknowledge that they're supplying a need, they're giving people what they want, do they really make society a better place? It seems to me that you're suggesting it's wrong to make a judgment about that. And I wonder why. Because I take your point that in giving charitably, you're indulging your preferences. But it seems to me the alternative is perhaps relinquishing your responsibility to engage in society as a moral subject rather than merely an economic subject. If we just leave everything to the market, we neglect an awful lot. And isn't there something to be said, even if we get it wrong, for having an argument about what is the right thing to do with surplus money?
Thanks. I'll come back with those questions, and I think there's some really interesting themes there. And I think this theme about this question of the motivation and whether it's a personal or even a narcissistic gesture, or whether giving is actually connected to a universal or some kind of broader social project. And I think that is an interesting question. The motivation and where this is coming from is something we should look at. And I think also the questions around is it a substitution for politics, or as individuals do we give? Shouldn't we be considering collectively areas of society where it's important that we develop or support, that there are public areas and that we have to make collective moral decisions about what we support and what we don't support, and that individual giving is simply bypassing that. So there's a number of questions. Who would like to come back first of all? Is there was a question certainly directed at you, Jeremy, there last.
Well,
like
I'll
to
try
come back on
and
that?
answer
Yeah.
the last point you made and the question in the
Yeah.
same go. Actually, charitable giving is a lot like politics. I'm not quite sure why this distinction is being drawn. I mean, the reason it's like politics is that in the case of charitable giving, what the consumer gets is decided not by the consumer's choices, and there's no price. The consumer doesn't pay a price, they just receive something. Now, in the case of private giving, what he receives is not a collective decision. So the whole population of Britain doesn't decide what the charity will spend its money on. So it's done in that sense privately. But that only improves the situation. Right? It's much better that this decision not be decided by a vote of the whole population of Britain, because there's almost no chance that the whole population of Britain is going to make any kind of a good decision on this. Right? They're far too far removed from the facts, and collectivizing this decision over a universe of people that's dispersed and massive, who don't pay for the decision they make, right? Who can just indulge themselves with a free vote. That's a bad way of making the decision. So, insofar as, and my objection, the objections I've raised towards charity are precisely that they mimic, to a small degree, politics in this way. In a market transaction, the people involved make the decisions, not third parties. And this comes back to the point about drugs and the drug suppliers and Justin Bieber. You may not like Justin Bieber or cocaine, and you might not want to spend your money on Justin Bieber or cocaine. But there are people who do like Justin Bieber and cocaine, and there are many people, actually, and they're willing to spend quite large sums of money on it. And it seems to me that it's immoral to even have a debate about whether they should get Justin Bieber or not. It's an outrageous moral hubris to even begin thinking about it. It's just not for you to decide. Third parties, and this is what democracy is, I'm afraid. It's a system whereby people vote on what third parties should get. And voting's free. Right? When I buy something, I've got to cough up my stuff for it. I've got to pay for that Justin Bieber ticket. You don't have to pay to stop me seeing Justin Bieber with your vote. So it's a very, very bad way of making decisions, whereas a transaction in which the consumer pays is an excellent way of making decisions.
I can sense that there is, I think, a desire to come back on some of that. I mean, you've literally, you're saying then you're not making a moral decision. You're backing away from that and just letting the.
No, I am making. I have a kind of meta-moral view. I think it's immoral to make people act against their preferences because of your preferences. And sitting around thinking, people have such an exalted view of their worldview. You go through the state education system now and get encouraged when you're 5 to think about moral issues. By the time you come out the other end, you think you're some kind of moral god who can, and you're just spouting the conventional wisdom of your age. And on the basis of your overconfidence in these homilies, you're willing to start pushing people around.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say that, and it's really developing the theme that we heard on terms of the mixed economy of giving, in that, yes, we must ensure that the state gives in the way that we vote them in to support the welfare system in the way we do, the government does. But we mustn't also forget that we are all people of free will, that we can make our own decisions about what we want to do with our money, and we should encourage that. Now, the other aspect is, I think, the reference to how has giving changed. If we go back probably to the 19th century, it was the rich philanthropists that built so much in this country in all sorts of different ways, with the arts, the architecture, etc., etc. Nowadays, we have a huge competition, and the charities are encouraged to develop that competition. Hence, we are bombarded in the way that was referred to correctly. And so we are now encouraged to use our free will in the way we can to work with that competition.
and competition is such a key word in politics, of course. So, in my view, it's all about how we use our free will to work within the competitive sector of the charity world, particularly at the present time.
Okay. I think the big question that came up from the floor really is that if philanthropy is the love of mankind, that expresses a kind of universal civic, at least, idea, and that's posed against the wearing the badge, it's all about me, privatised gesture. And I think that, Jamie, you're really coming in here with a very sort of extreme version of this. I mean, you are because the
debate.
The civic idea or the universal idea is connected to the idea of a good society. So it has a connection back into a social, an individual act of philanthropy, however, which is connected to a bigger idea, which is a shared idea, a universal idea. Piers, do you want to come back?
Yes, actually, I wanted to just maybe come back on 3 points, or at least at most 3 points from the floor. I mean, maybe come out to that later. The first question was, aren't we just sort of personalising what's given too much? You have these posters which maybe tug our heartstrings, which appeal to our sentimentality. And I think that is true, and I think it's a problem. And I don't think we should imagine that just because a cause is charitable, and therefore it should be supported. I mean, one example might be some of the extreme forms of advertising for animal charities. I mean, animal charities are very wealthy in this country because people like animals, particularly cuddly ones that look a bit like us, like cats and so on. That's all right, you know. Well, they look a bit like us, you know. That's all right, that's fine. But I think that, you know, and if you run an animal charity, of course, your business is to make as much as you can for it. But I think there is, of course, that sentimentality danger that was mentioned. On the point about why the poor give more, if it's from the back, if it's indeed the case they do, it's an interesting question. I've certainly seen that claim made before, that poorer people are more generous. I suspect the reason could well be that in the case of rich people, or at least some of them, they are rich precisely because they're meaner. That's how they got there. They just wanted to make a lot of money for themselves and their own. So those dispositions are carried forward into their tendency or lack of it to give to the poor. But it's a very good point, and I certainly have noticed it. Very rich people who sort of get very picky about whether they've overpaid their butlers and so on, and this sort of thing. The point about crack dealers and so on, which is very interesting. I mean, Jamie has this very powerful point that says, you know, isn't it rather patronising to say we're going to give you what we think you need and not what you actually want? Of course, you can do both. You might decide, if I had a choice between giving £1,000 to two people wanting it, one wants it to pay his rent and can't afford it otherwise, the other wants to sort of binge on cocaine for a weekend, I can say, well, so long as they're both things they want, I'm quite entitled to decide, you know, which is the one which is the better cause to give to. I mean, maybe I should be constrained by their wants, but I'm entitled to go beyond that. So I think that's how I'd settle that one. On the question of virtue, though, yes, of course, you know, the widow's mite and so on, I think it is the case that we shouldn't judge people's moral virtue in giving just in terms of the amount. We should judge it in other terms too, like why they did it and how much it cost them personally. And there is a real tension between making the world a better place, and making the world a more virtuous place.
One thing, I mean, on motivation, I mean, is basically just a historical fact, is that the majority of the world used to be religious, and religions not only say it's a good thing to give, it is a command, but basically, if you look at all the chantry chapels, which Henry VIII demolished quite a few of them, if not most of them, but those chapels were endowed in the abbeys and churches and cathedrals of this nation and every other Christian country in the world, because basically you endowed a charity or a chapel basically to reduce your time in purgatory. So effectively it was quite the basis of all philanthropy in the modern era is practical, because if you give, you will spend less time in purgatory and more time in heaven. So it's quite straightforward, but of course that is now shifted. But you know, a Christian phrase, love thy neighbour as thyself, and you know, philanthropy is about the word love. It's about caring for people. But, you know, there is now in the modern state a problem that I gather, and I've heard it from the charitable sector, that there are more charities attempting to help the homeless in London than the number of homeless on the streets every night in this capital city. There are too many charities. I mean, everyone who has a tragedy in their life sets up a charity for, I mean, you know, if they've lost a child or whatever, another charity is set up. And the Charity Commission allow anybody to set up a charity if it fulfills charitable regulations, which is balmy. We should be people working together, because one of the great growths is in charity administrators. But, you know, but the motivations of giving are basically fundamentally religious. And that fundamental historical reality has both been good and bad. But though we are now a non-religious community, I think it's rather wonderful that we still care about our fellow human beings. And caring is what it's ultimately about, whether we go to heaven or hell or stay around in limbo.
And Colin, just you worked obviously in the arts and funding for the arts. It's an area that's quite interesting when you look at the way, though, that whether it's a state sponsorship or state support or personal private investment or philanthropy. Something that that Jamie said, you know, about the giver imposes their view, their moral view on the recipient. And that's kind of, is there something to be said about there is a problem where the beneficiary then is expected to provide something in return, he who pays the piper, and so on. And is there a tension then between freedom and independence and, say, state giving, which in Jamie's consumer model actually would, where you do actually have in the arts now a movement towards just small individual investors and bigger investors. Does that actually free things up a bit?
I think the Arts Council concept is in theory fantastic, but in reality they impose far more restrictions, in my experience, than the private donor, philanthropist, or trust and foundation. And remember, trust and foundations, I mean, all these great trusts and foundations, which are now the Paul Hamlin Foundation, the Sainsbury Foundations, etc., the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, though they are now all, I mean, you know, Carnegie itself, these are great foundations, often 100 years old. They were all originally set up by very rich people. The danger of the private sector is when the state thinks it's the best way of funding all the arts, because the majority of the state, or the things that the state is now no longer funding, like a lot of libraries for local authorities, the private sector doesn't want to support, and that is a real challenge. But my view is always that the state that the private sector supplements the state, not replaces it. I think that is the essence of taxation. That's why I think all philanthropists should pay their tax first. And certainly we should not honour by the state anybody who hasn't paid UK tax. Now, that is a controversial view in the arts, because basically when I ran arts and business, I was told I must support non-doms, you know, non-domiciled residents. I mean, we've all heard that, you know, that nice Mr. Branson or Sir Richard Branson's now going to play tennis all day, but still be a philanthropist, but he won't be paying tax on his foreign income.
Thank you. I'm going to go back out again.
As a follow-up from what I think Colin started to say originally and has been touched on just now, about philanthropists, you know, should they have a say in how the money is used? Because if you think about Gates and Bono and that ilk, they spend a lot of their time in Africa, in countries where there isn't really any state infrastructure worth talking about. So do you think then that they should become the substitute state, or isn't that a problem? Isn't that taking away a responsibility from the people in charge of that country of developing that infrastructure? Or do you think that they should literally hand out their money and say to people, use this as you see fit, you know what to do with it. This is this amount, I'll give you each, you know, $1 million, you do it.
Obviously, like with the current administration and the previous one, there was this big push to grow the third or fourth sector or whatever it's called, and now we have the idea of the big society. So I was wondering what the panel's thoughts were on, is that especially Cameron, was there an attempt to reintroduce this kind of Christian doctrine of giving? And also for Jamie, is then the likes of Wonga and these kind of short-term cash day loans, is that the type of model that you think should be set up for, like, kind of they're giving their capital away so that people can get what they want? Is that the type of charity that, or not charity, but type of economic charity that you would propose?
To what extent, I suppose for all panel members, to what extent does the pressure of being in the limelight for the famous devalue their donations, and to what extent does the sort of rather manipulative, sometimes advertising that the average person is exposed to devalue their donations, does that manipulation in some sense make their donations less valuable?
Does the giver have a responsibility to make sure that the funds are used well?
Yeah, should the giver, the question that we left just before we took the questions on the floor, how much say does the giver have in how the money is spent? And there was a question there about, does this essentially, could this undermine democracies or the will of the majority of the people? An individual can imbalance that. I'm thinking about people like Gates and Bono. And charity, which has a return on the investment, it's kind of connected in a way. That was another question. And I think also again going back to the idea of the question of the motivation and the moral value of the motivation, and is being in the limelight, does that detract in any way from the good of giving? Anyone like to come back on some of those?
Well, I got a direct question, so I might as well answer that one. Wonga is a short-term lenders generally provide a very valuable service, and so I'm all in favour of them. It's not a charity, it's a business, and the person who takes out the loan isn't in receipt of charity either. They have to pay quite high rates of interest. So it serves a purpose that people might otherwise turn to charity for. I personally found myself in the situation of somebody who needed a short-term loan. I would much rather go to Wonga than to a charity, because I trust Wonga much more to just tell me the deal, I'll do the business. I'm not going to get in the grips of Wonga's worldview. It's a deal, right? So I'm happy to deal with them. I'm not happy to deal with a charity. Then, same speaker, and then I'll stop. The big society, it's a kind of vision of British society in which everybody sees themselves as engaged in ministering to other people in society. It makes me want to puke. It is nauseating conception of British citizens as weak, helpless characters in need of help, support from these nice types like David Cameron who are going to kind of pat you and coax you along. It's a revolting conception of society and what's going on. I want to see a society in which there's almost no charity, because nobody is out there asking for charitable support. Charity, it's intrinsically bad, right, in the sense that I know it's a nice reaction to hardship, but I mean, it would be a better world if there were no charity in it, right, because there were no need for charity. The idea of a very rich country like Britain being one in which everybody is wrapped up in charity, it's just plain weird. It's a kind of moral, I don't know, I find it revolting, but apparently it's supposed to be grand and nice.
Is the problem for you that it implies that someone is in a sort of vulnerable and weak position and someone else is able to... Is that the transaction that... It's not a transaction of equality? Is that the problem?
Yes. And I mean, you'll notice the word vulnerable is now very popular. You hear it all the time. Every policy, it's going to affect vulnerable people. Where did all these vulnerable people come from? We've had centuries of people getting 12 years of education, well, not centuries, but a century, supplied by the state, and somehow at the end of it, we're all still bloody useless and vulnerable. Is this ever going to end?
And are there areas then in public life then that you would say taxation, which is a sort of in a sense, a collective giving towards. Would you regard that as a good thing? That
No.
Wonga pays its taxes and.
Oh, well, Wonga has to pay its taxes. As I said before, I think that a lot of what's going on here a lot of this talk about private charity and about state organised charity, the issues are roughly the same. I mean, the beneficiaries of state. I think I'd rather get my money from the state than from a charity because, again, there's a kind of anonymous quality to it. I don't have to satisfy some particular old woman's ideas of how to lead my life. But on the other hand, it does create all sorts of perverse incentives. So I really think the difference between the state mechanism and the private mechanism, there are some interesting differences. But what's problematic about charity is all there in the state mechanism as well. For example, take the state funding of the arts. I'm taxed to pay for art that I think is ridiculous. I mean, utterly ridiculous.
Can I look at that in terms of? I thought it was a very interesting question about the, which is very much connected, that the interference of, say, one super rich person who gives generously to a country that has an undeveloped infrastructure can actually be destabilising for that country's autonomy, its independence. Would you like to come back, anyone, on that one?
Well, I think there is a serious dilemma here, particularly when you're dealing with third world countries, in that there is continually the concern about how money will be used. And therefore you have this major debate about how you influence what your money is going towards. There are so many examples where people will say, well, I really don't want to give directly to that country, but I will do it through a charity to make certain it's used properly. Well, I mean, there is a serious arrogance there, as well as a certain amount of sense, and I think it's a huge issue that I don't think there's a clear answer to be perfectly honest. So Bill Gates giving his money for specific aspects of aid in Africa or whatever, who should be spending that money in order that it makes the maximum benefit? It's I think, a serious issue. Can I just also come back on Jamie's comments about the big society? I almost thought I was going to agree with him for the first time this morning. But I do genuinely agree that the big society is a disaster, but for almost entirely the opposite reasons, in that it sort of ignored the fact that, frankly, so much of this has been happening already, and happening by a huge number of people already too. So to suddenly launch something that already exists, but isn't actually splashed around in the way that necessarily Mr. Cameron wanted it to be done, is indeed... it was definitely the wrong direction to introduce that in big society. Let's celebrate what's happening.
Do you want a couple more responses, and we might take a very quick last round if we can. So.
Yes, well, just on the point about the big society, I agree with that. It's a bit like the third way. Remember the third way? In the mid-90s, everybody talked about the third way. I assume it's been achieved because nobody's ever talking about it anymore. It must have been. The same thing is true of the big society. But the thing about the big society, it's waffle. It doesn't really mean anything. It means that people should be good to each other. Well, yes, I agree with that, and that's all very well. But turning it into a policy is vacuous. I just want briefly to come on to some points that were raised from the floor and also came up in this related panel discussion. This question of whether philanthropists or indeed individual givers should have a say in how the money is used is a genuinely difficult one. And you have at one extreme the problem of wealthy philanthropists who, say, set up schools with the proviso that, say, biblical creationism should be taught, or that only a special diet should be fed in the school canteen, or whatever crank condition it might be. Do you take the money and say, well, at least some good is being done, and accept the condition, or do you have some central body that just determines the conditions for accepting the money? This is extremely difficult because philanthropists, I think, are prima facie entitled to decide how their money is spent. But I don't know exactly how the problems to be resolved. It also, I think, goes back to this question of do you give to the person, if you're an individual giver, the person who is starving or the person who just wants to fund a cocaine habit. I think I might want to say in that case, I'm quite entitled to decide not to give money to the person who wants cocaine because I say that's a want which I'm entitled not to satisfy. If I were satisfying some charitable urge, maybe I should also satisfy a want, but then again, I can do that while satisfying what I consider to be a need, or at least something better as well. And on the question about manipulation, I suppose there's a question about the psychology of giving. Are we unduly manipulated by people, by brands and by celebrities? I'm sure we are, but I suppose the thinking is better give misguidedly than nothing at all. So perhaps that's not such a great problem.
Can I just, I suppose the name Bill Gates has been mentioned more than anybody else. I would recommend, if people haven't heard Bill Gates' David Dimbleby lecture, which he gave this year at the Royal Institution, you can certainly download it from the BBC. I mean, Bill Gates' lecture was incredibly detailed. I mean, I've never seen so many sort of facts and figures. But he basically said, if I do nothing else in my life, I basically want to rid the world of malaria. He said, that's my focus. I will put every penny I have to rid the world of malaria. That's not a bad focus to save countless millions, particularly in Africa, from a terrible, terrible death. So I think, and of course that, and the way he's doing it is by using his intellect. Some people don't like what Microsoft did, as a global giant. But the fact is, he is a brilliant man, and what he's doing, and others who've, like Warren Buffett, who've joined him, is what is this new growth area called venture philanthropy, where they're using their philanthropic giving in very much like venture capitalism. They are capitalists, and their focus is to make the world a better place by their intellect. They are totally directing their philanthropy. They are firing and hiring people all over Africa, but they are basically saying, we do know best because we're hiring the best people to help. Now, that may be pure arrogance to some people, but it actually, I believe, if Bill Gates can save the world from malaria, I'll give him whatever he wants in praise, because I think that's not bad, because no single government, as his argument is, can do that. The UN can't do it, but perhaps Bill Gates with his billions can.
But can I just suggest that someone made the point from the floor that there is a danger then of philanthropy then becoming a substitute for politics, because if Bill Gates wants to end malaria, if people want to end malaria, is that not a political project? The money, the giving of the money by the one person whose mission it is, bypasses that.
But maybe he's the only person in the world who can do it, because politics, most politicians of the world are short-term, incompetent, dishonest, and should go to prison.
Yeah, just on the issue of what I consider the rather cynical view of vulnerability, I've actually worked as a community consultant the other side of the river for about 15 years in mental health. And I can tell you that whatever people say about vulnerability, there is always going to be a vulnerability. And my view about charities and charitable status is the fact that I'm convinced, certainly from my point of view, that if charities are set up to fulfill a purpose, whether or not people feel that they're needed, I think that actually can drive policy change. My particular example that I'm involved with is addictions and alcohol in older people, and that there is a need there. And I think if charities can demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that they are benefiting and they're improving health outcomes, social outcomes, I think that can actually be a very positive driver for government policy. And in the end, government policy can actually replace some of those endeavours and those aspirations.
Point on malaria and the developing countries and Bill Gates, clearly. I mean, do you not think that the real answer to solving or getting rid of malaria, and certainly in a lot of countries where malaria has been eradicated, is more to do with social and economic development in those countries? Because if you think about Bill Gates or anyone who just throws money into distributing as many nets, there was a period when even DDT, which was very instrumental in getting rid of malaria, was prevented from being used for environmental reasons. So when it comes down to the crux of it, malaria is about poverty, it's about environmental conditions. And in my head, rather than having Bill Gates continuously throwing his money at it, would it not make more sense to allow those countries to develop to a degree where they themselves can get rid of situations like malaria?
I was just wondering, especially because lots has been mentioned about developing countries, wondering if there's a thing within Western charities to do this idea of like a white Western saviour. And it's obviously beneficial for them to paint lots of places, especially in Africa, as still a lot more impoverished and lacking a lot of things that they actually have. So there's loads of charities within Africa, especially, I don't know if you've watched the recent Stephen Fry documentary out there. So an amazing charity in Uganda that is working to help gay sexual health and things like that, which sounds very progressive. But that's not an image you would ever get from Western charities who want to help. So I'm just wondering if sometimes charities help superficially, but hinder Western prejudices against developing countries by still suggesting that we need to go and help them because they can't help themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panellists to just give a closing summary or response. We start off with Jamie, then Colin, Anthony and Piers. Jamie, do you want to come back?
I think what I've perhaps been getting at and not quite arriving at is that the effects of charity on the beneficiaries are not wholly good. There's quite a lot of economic evidence that foreign aid hinders rather than promotes economic development, quite simply because it allows bad governance to continue without bringing about the calamitous effects it normally would. And so it takes the pressure off people in government to mend their ways. And, of course, it can have this effect not just at that level, but all around the place. And I think charity is a natural and moral response to seeing hardship. But I do not think it's a good system, of running society. It's something that is it's regrettably needed. And yet I see in Britain today, and big society embodies this, the idea that it would be a vision of society in which we had all these needy people and all these charitable nice people, and maybe there's sometimes both the same people. I don't really understand it. That's the kind of society we want to live in. I think we want to be moving away from that, a society in which people are all consumers, buying things with money that they've earned. That is much more a vision of society that I like, and I don't think that charity and devoting ourselves to being charitable in any way promotes such a society.
My final comment on on Bill Gates. I mean, obviously, you're absolutely right that the economic issues, and I think, to be fair, the David Dimbleby lecture, Gates talks a lot about supporting the economic infrastructure of countries as well, because it's basically the attitude: don't give someone a bowl of rice, give them the seeds to grow their own rice. But I ripped out of a Close Brothers, which is a private bank. It's their brochure for rich people, and it's basically managing their wealth. And I was struck by the quotation in it by a man called Etienne de Grellet, who was born in 1773 and died in 1855. I'd never heard of him, but I thought the phrase they use in their document, which is about wealth management, was, I thought, rather good for today, and I'll just close on that. And he's basically said these words: I shall pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness that I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not defer or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again. I thought that was rather good.
Thank you.
The role of charities, in a sense, in the democracy of our society, in terms of their role of advising government in the ways that they can benefit the people generally, and I think that's we've rather looked at charities from the other side, but actually they are major advisors to government and the democracy of our society. Secondly, I would just emphasise my specific role that giving is there to be democratised, and let's get on with it.
Thank you, Anthony.
Well, on the question of whether charitable giving does any good, I think the proper response is to say, well, give to a charity which demonstrably does do good, and don't if it doesn't. Clearly, there's no point wasting money on causes that don't actually work or line the pockets of dictators, but that's not an argument against charitable giving. It's an argument against irresponsible or foolish charitable giving. I do think that in spite of the perfectly good moral points Jamie and others made about creating dependency and the degradation of receiving, I think if you really do find yourself in need, you'd rather have that need satisfied, even if you felt possibly a bit degraded in the process. A lot of giving can actually, in any case, be aimed at increasing people's autonomy and not just doing what is considered to be in their interests. Which is why if I had £1,000 just to give away to somebody, I might say, yes, it's yours to do what you want with it. It's a chance for you to make your own decisions. I'm not going to say how you should spend it. I could well say that. So it seems to me the case against charity has not been made, and that the motive and the virtue of kindness is one that we ought to value and put into practice.
So we'll just finish with a big thank you to all the contributions on the floor and from the panellists. Thank you.